Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today I am going to tell you what I think is an hilarious story about the fallout from when France sent their condolences to the United States on behalf of the death of Benjamin Franklin. Now, before we get started, I will say, you'll notice I got a nice haircut. I actually had gotten one fairly recently, and they didn't cut it short. I like to let it grow and then cut it short. Let it grow, cut it short. Anyway, so Benjamin Franklin unfortunately passes away. Let's start a little bit earlier. George Washington takes over as President of the United States in April of 1789. About 3 months later, over in France, they storm the Bastille and start the French Revolution and cobble together the National Assembly. And then about 8 months after that, about a year after Washington takes president, Benjamin Franklin passes away. Now, what's interesting about France is, at this point, the King Louis XVI is still King of France, and there's a revolutionary assembly now going on, and America is friends with all of them. Like, we're still officially friendly with King Louis, who had helped us out during the Revolutionary War, but many Americans understand the Republican appeal of what the National Assembly is doing. So, when Ben Franklin passes away, first Congress is, and the Senate and the House of Representatives, the capital is still New York City. And word arrives in New York, and the Senate does nothing. First of all, we like to look back and say Ben Franklin was amazing, and he was. But he definitely made his fair share of enemies. So when the Senate heard about his death, most people were sad, but they didn't do anything about it. Many people didn't think it was the place of the Senate to officially recognize a private citizen, which there definitely was an argument to be made for that. It had never been done before. And other people didn't want to recognize Franklin because, he could be kind of a jerk. The House of Representatives, however, James Madison proposed that they have I think it was a month of mourning or 3 days of wearing a patch. I forget exactly what his proposal was, but said, let's officially mourn this man. And the House of Representatives unanimously passed that. So, word got to France that Franklin had passed away. And they had heard that both the House and the Senate were recognizing him, and they were doing a big show of it. Now, this wasn't true, but word traveled fast by ship back then. So, the National Assembly, a revolutionary assembly, who, again, Franklin had been there just 10 years before, not even. Well, yeah, no, this is 89, yeah, it's 90, so 6 years before is when Franklin left. So they knew him, and they were inspired by him, not just as a revolutionary and as a proponent of republicanism, but as, the famous scientist Dr. Franklin was. So they decided that, one of the men gave a eulogy, and they printed up copies of the eulogy and mailed 26 copies of the eulogy to the United States with an official letter of condolences, and they sent it in a package. And the package got to the United States, and it was addressed to the President and the members of the American Congress. So, back under the Articles of Confederation, what they would have meant was obvious. They sent it to the Continental Congress, who, chose among themselves a president whose job was mostly ceremonial and was only important because he was the one to sign the documents that went out. Now, when it arrived, we need to keep in mind that the Vice President of the United States is also the President of Congress. Really the President of the Senate, more than Congress at large. But, again, when we say Congress nowadays, we generally like to think House of Representatives, but Congress is both the Senate and the House. So they send this letter of condolence over, and it goes to George Washington. And Washington looks at it, and he always, as is tradition, like to default to Congress. He was very much in favor of separation of powers, didn't want to look like he was overstepping his bounds. So he gets this package and says, no, they must have meant Congress. Like, he didn't know what was inside of it. He said, they must have meant Congress. I will forward this to John Adams, Vice President of the United States, also President of Congress. And John Adams gets it and says, what is this? You know, John Adams wasn't the most happy with France. And he goes, what is this? It's like, I don't think I'm supposed to open this, because, you know, Washington had sent it through Tobias Lear, who was his personal secretary. And Lear didn't really say much. So Adams like, I don't think we're supposed to, you know, it's addressed to the president and the members of the American Congress. So since the president is first here, they must mean president. So he sends it back to Washington. Washington gets it and says, no. This has to be for them. How do I handle this? Washington says, I know. I'll send it to someone it's not addressed to, who is not just a third party, but is in charge of foreign correspondence. And that was the Secretary of State. So he forwards it to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson gets it and says, yeah, I'll open it. Because Thomas Jefferson was very self-confident. And he opens it up and sees that it's just a letter of condolences and 26 copies of this eulogy for Franklin. So he sends it back to Washington and says, hey, it's no big deal. This is just what it is. Washington gets it and says, well, there's 26 copies. Clearly it was meant for Congress, because at the time there were 13, at the time there were 14 states. Kentucky was just about to roll in too, but Vermont had already joined. But 26 copies, 2 senators from each of the 13 states. This must be for the Senate. So he sends it over to John Adams, who gets it, and he reads it out loud to everyone, and apparently he's making, like, snotty comments about, like, oh, they got rid of titles of nobility, good for them. And he says, and basically Adams says, I don't care about this. And there were a few people who were not super happy about how, and I believe it was Thomas Macaulay is the one who wrote the most about it in his journal. And he's not super happy, but most of Congress is like, this kind of late communication, this general, you know, ceremonial type of communication, it's below us. We're the Senate. So they took the hot potato and sent it down to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives said, okay, great. We want to be involved. Because again, this is just about a year and a half after the United States, under the Constitution as we knew it today, began. So there were still policy procedures that were being figured out. And the House of Representatives was like, yeah, we want to be involved. So they split it in half and sent it back. They sent half of the copies of the eulogy back to Congress and said, you hold on to this is for you. And they sent a letter to Washington and said, okay, we think the best resolution for this is for you to write them a letter and say, thanks for the letter of condolences. Like, again, that's all we're talking about here. And Washington, now that he has been instructed by the people, as represented in the House, was comfortable saying thank you. Of course, he wrote a letter and sent it to Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, who then finally sent the letter over to France saying, we appreciate the condolences on this great American. So I'm going to leave it at that today. I think that is an hilarious story, but I also think it speaks a lot to the position that the initial United States government was in, where it's like, okay, who exactly does what? Who's responsible for what? The Constitution outlines certain things very clearly, but most of the procedural things are, I mean, there's like very little procedural stuff written in the Constitution. I mean, I suppose that's an over, that's, it's not 100% true. There are procedural things in there, but a lot of the day-to-day minutia is not in there. So, again, I'm going to leave it there. I feel like that's a fun way to start the week. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section. If you like this video, please hit like. If you liked it especially, definitely subscribe so you can see more fun stories about the American Revolution here at Founder of the Day. I will see you tomorrow.